Okay. Hey, everybody. This is July the 6th, 10 o'clock in the morning, and this is History 181, where I just chat with you a little bit, go over the PowerPoints, go over the material we're looking at this week, and give you announcements and whatever else is all going on in our course. I just noted on Blackboard, and I will continue to note that for whatever reason, I guess because they're just overwhelmed right now with so many people doing this kind of stuff, YouTube continues to not want to show the links to the current, most recent stuff in a timely fashion. I just went and looked at our page, on our channel page on YouTube, and they don't have any of them up past last week. They never posted the links for upcoming, which they're supposed to, and they haven't posted the one I just finished yet, even though it's done. It's not there. So I will continue to try to post the links in Blackboard because, see, I'm able to get them directly right off of my StreamYard program. So I'm going to continue to post those links so that you can get there. In fact, let me make sure I put the right one today. AYOW. And let me see. Give me just a second to make sure that it's going out at all. Yeah, it's up now. They don't. They took away the one I just did, and now they have this one listed as live now. So I don't know what the deal is with YouTube. They've lost their freaking minds. Well, anyway. All right, let's take a quick look at the syllabus. Let's take it just to kind of make sure we know what we're doing right now, and take a look at what's going on and what we need to be worrying about. So this is the 2020 summer. I'll go ahead and throw it over there for you. There you go. All right, so yeah, you can't read that. And you still can't read that. Okay, that's probably a little bit better anyway. So let's see. So you had your first exam last week, and those grades should be in the grade book now in Blackboard. And then this week, we will be looking at the Roaring 20s and the 30s. And the material that will be on exam 2, because exam 2 is a midterm and it's longer. So the material that will be on exam 2 is part 4, discontent and reform, part 5, the progressives, part 6, World War I, part 7, the Roaring 20s, and part 8, the 30s, right? So there's 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. There's 5 parts that will be on your midterm, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And I will post that exam about this time next week, so that you'll have today to go over the last of it. And then if you have any questions you want to ask me about it, you'll have this coming week that we can talk about it. You can email me about it or whatever. And then on Monday, a week from now, I'll go ahead and post that exam. It'll be a longer exam. It'll have maybe an essay question, depending on how I can make it work on here. It'll definitely have quite a few, like 50 multiple choice. So it'll take you a little longer than 30 minutes probably to take it, depending on how fast you are. So when you set up to take it, remember, you have to finish it in one go. So make sure you have like a block of time. Classes normally get the full hour and 15 minutes of my classes to take it. Some students get up and leave after 20 minutes. Some stay the whole hour and 15. It just depends on you. But make sure you have about an hour, okay, available just in case, before you start the exam. If you got 10 minutes, don't start the exam, because then you're going to answer the first few questions, and you're going to turn it off, and it's going to turn itself in. All right. So let's. The other thing is, don't forget your papers are coming up July 27. So you've got 3 weeks to get those in and turned in to me. And if you've emailed me in the last couple of days over the weekend, I was not on my email over the weekend, but I'll certainly be looking at those during my office hours today. So if you're waiting to hear back from me, you will hear back from me this afternoon. I've got this class. I've got one more session from 11 to 12, and then I'll have my lunch. And then pretty much from 1 to 4, I'll be here answering emails and working on putting together your midterm for next week and the 101 classes midterm for today. They're about a week. Their schedule is different from yours. Okay, so what we want to do today is look at the 20s and the 30s, and we can do that. Let's look at the 20s. All right, so if you have any questions right now while you're watching, just drop them in the comments section over there, and I'll see them and I'll answer them. Otherwise, send me an email this either today or this week, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. So where we left off in the last time was World War I came to an end, and the country had gone through, think about it, we'd gone through the 1890s, the 1900s, and the early 1910s of the progressive era, where everything was change, try to make the country better, try to improve things, but it was a lot of change. And people don't always like a lot of change. Change kind of exhausts, particularly older people, right? Older people get exhausted by change. They don't like change. They want things to stay the way they always have been. This is what we call conservative, right? Liberal or progressive is I want to change things. I want to make things better. Conservative is I like things how they were, leave them alone, right? They're two equally valid points of view. But the conservatives, there's always, our country's kind of divided in half, as we well know, right? There's half one and half the other. And so, well, there's like a third one, a third the other, and a third that just doesn't really care or pay attention at all in the middle. But, and that's their right too, of course. But what happens is there's always an action and then a reaction. The lash and the backlash, back and forth. I mean, if you think about how we elect presidents the last few years, right? We had Reagan and Bush. So then we had Bill Clinton. So then we had George W. Bush. So then we had Barack Obama. So then we had Donald Trump. And then we'll see what happens, right, in November. I guarantee you this. I don't know who's going to win in November. But if Donald Trump wins in November, I promise you there will be a Democrat elected in 2024. Because it's really, really hard in this country to keep the same thing going for more than 8 years, right? Al Gore came close after Clinton. Bush was able to do it for 4 years after Reagan. But otherwise, Hillary Clinton was not able to do it after 8 years of Obama. So we'll see, right? But it swings back and forth. So after 25 roughly years of the progressive era, now as we get into the 20s, we get a conservative decade where the pendulum swings back to the right. And oops, hold on. Hit the wrong mouse button. There we go. So the Roaring 20s, I'm going to look at it through several different areas. In politics, we got the 19th Amendment. This was really something that had been in the works from the progressives for years. It finally comes to fruition just in time for the 1920 election, which means women got to vote in the 1920 election for the first time ever. And the 1920 election had twice as many votes cast as any election in American history. So you could tell that women did go out and vote. And they elected Warren Harding, the conservative Republican, interestingly enough, because they had opposed women voting. And he believed in isolationism. He felt like it had been a mistake for the U.S. to get involved in World War I. And so he talked about a return to normalcy, meaning that Harding wanted things back to normal after all these years of World War and progressive turmoil. Now, the funny thing, of course, is there's no such word as normalcy. There's normality. He kind of made up a word, but if there's one thing we know about presidents, they do like to make up their own words sometimes that don't actually, but we knew what they mean, right? George W. Bush was always making up words like my favorite George W. Bush made up word was when Bush achieved something that people didn't think he could achieve, he said, hey, people misunderestimated me. And people are like, wait, misunderestimated? That's not a word. You could misunderstand and you could underestimate. He combined them into misunderestimate. But here was the thing. We all knew what he meant, right? He'd made up a word. So Harding did the same thing. He basically made up normalcy, and people knew exactly what he meant. Okay, so they liked that. He did have a number. He was one of the more scandal-plagued of all of our presidents. It's really a miracle he didn't get impeached. In fact, he probably would have been impeached, except that he died before he could be brought up on charges over Teapot Dome. Teapot Dome was like the Watergate or the Russia meddling, of the 1920s. It was a big financial scandal involving payoffs and bribes that he was implicated in. And he might have been impeached and he might have been convicted, but he died of a heart attack before anything could happen. So he's replaced by his very inactive, quiet vice president, Calvin Coolidge, who I always compare to a bank president. Coolidge was just sort of like, he looks like a mannequin sitting there, and he kind of was like a mannequin. Very inactive, very conservative, more freedom for business. He famously said, the business of America is business. And so he wanted business to do whatever it wanted to do, regardless of the price, the cost to the average people, the consumers, the workers. He believed very strongly in isolationism, that it had been a mistake for the United States to get involved in World War I. And he wasn't going to get the U.S. involved in anything else. In fact, if you are reading the Bill Bryson book for your paper, and you don't have to, but if you are, Bryson talks about how there was an enormous flood on the Mississippi River just north of us during 1927. And Coolidge was asked, what is the federal government going to do to help with this disaster? And Coolidge said, nothing. It's not my business. Let Illinois worry about it. Let Iowa worry about it. Let Missouri worry about it. It's not my business. He very much felt that the federal government didn't need to do anything. Just stay out of the way. Except he did like tax cuts for the rich. Okay, here's one of the things I love about Coolidge. They said, well, for your re-election, election for the first time in 1924, his advisors said, we need to show you out doing fun things. You can't just look like a boring bank president sitting there all the time. You need to be doing things. And they said, what do you like to do? And he's like, I don't like to do anything. I'm Calvin Coolidge. I don't do anything. And they're like, well, we could take pictures of you fishing. And he's like, okay, I don't fish. Well, we'll show you how. So you see in this picture, this was taken for like campaign purposes. They took him out back when Washington, D.C. was still mostly a swamp. Some would argue it still is today, of course, metaphorically. There was a creek. And so they put him in waders and had him go out and fish in a creek. Of course, the problem is he's still wearing his three-piece suit and tie, and he really looks like he doesn't have a clue what he's doing with a fishing pole, does he? You got to love it. So this is like, the early version of Dukakis in a tank, or John Kerry in his camouflage hunting gear in 2004, where it just doesn't look right. No. They might as well have had him throwing a football. He'd have been out there like, so. Oh, but the one thing Coolidge did, I may have this picture coming up, so I want to make sure I set this up properly. I have this picture coming up in a minute. He went out to a dude ranch in like Montana, one of those places where people from the city can go and ride horses for a week and pretend to be a cowboy. And they were so excited to have the president of the United States come to their ranch that the people running it created this big red and white cowboy outfit for him. And not just like a cowboy outfit like you'd see in a Western. They created like one that a little kid would sit in front of the TV and watch Western movies in the 50s or something with, right? Like his giant hat, giant chaps with cowl on them. And they thought, well, he's never, he's Calvin Coolidge. He's never going to wear this get up. But he might take it back to the White House and put it on display or something. And that would be cool. Oh, no. Coolidge loved it, and he wore it. Look at that. That's awesome. There's the president in his imagine Donald Trump putting on that. I mean, you just can't. And you can see his wife is just like, oh, my God. Oh, my God, what is he doing? He loved it. He wore it all the time. So you just never know about people. Oh, the Klan. So immigration during the 20s was at its was starting to be restricted, right? We talked last time about how during the golden age of immigration, you had millions and millions of immigrants coming over, largely from Europe, some from Asia. But after 1920, in a more conservative time, just like, with Donald Trump and immigration restrictions today, right? The Republicans of the 1920s also kind of pushed through restrictions on immigration based on country of origin. Again, this sounds very familiar, doesn't it? And so they wanted fewer Jewish and Catholic immigrants. They wanted more Christian and more from Western Europe. Problem was, by that point, Western Europe, they didn't want to come to the United States. They weren't interested, right? So it's like the joke today, where President Trump said he didn't want immigrants coming from Muslim countries. He said, why not, or African countries? He said, what about Norway? Why can't we have more immigrants from Norway? To which Norway replied, we're richer than you per capita, and we have free health care. Why in the world would we want to live in the United States? To which I'm like, good question. A new Ku Klux Klan arose during these years. They infamously burned a cross on Stone Mountain, where the big Confederate memorial is. That's been in the news this week. I've climbed Stone Mountain a couple of times and been up there. It's a humongous thing. It looks, if you see a picture of Stone Mountain, it looks smaller than Mount Rushmore. It is much larger. It's just that the mountain that Mount Rushmore, the president's heads is carved into, is a lot smaller. So it makes the presidents look bigger. But the mountain, Stone Mountain, that Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis and Stonewall Jackson carved into, is a much bigger rock. And so the pictures look smaller, but they're much bigger. So a new Ku Klux Klan was born with a more broad, this is the Klan of the 20s and 30s that pretended to be like the Rotary Club or something. The Klan during these years had enormous membership. They had a lot of members because they posed themselves as like a civic organization. They covered up, papered over their violent, racist past and pretended to be more like just like the Rotary Club or the JCs or something. And they attracted a large number of members for a number of years. But by the way, the new Klan was not, let's differentiate. The original Ku Klux Klan came up after the Civil War, and their entire purpose was to be against the former slaves, right? They were an anti-black organization, start to finish. That's what they were, anti-black, anti-former slave, keep those people, quote, under control, unquote. This new Ku Klux Klan that came about in the 20s, they hated anybody that wasn't them. They didn't like blacks. They didn't like Jews. They didn't like Catholics. If you were white but you were Catholic, they didn't even like you. They didn't like anybody that wasn't what they were. So they hated they were equal opportunity haters. Give them that, I guess. In culture in the 20s, we had a fundamentalist Christian crusade. Remember, the pendulum nationally had swung left for a while with the progressives and all the agrarian, the Farmers Alliance and everything. Now it swings to the right. You'd had kind of like an Enlightenment period where people were looking at science and reason, and now it swings back where Christians rise up and start having revival meetings, right? This is the beginnings of the 20th century revivalist movement all over the country. And it culminated in 1925 with what's called the Scopes monkey trial. What happened was that Tennessee, oh boy, it involves Tennessee. This can never end well, right? Tennessee had passed a law saying that it was illegal for teachers to teach evolution in public schools. And of course, there were many people that wanted to challenge this. And so a young high school teacher named Scopes started teaching evolution in his science classes in this high school in Tennessee, in Dayton, Tennessee. He got arrested for breaking the law for teaching science in the science class. And so he was put on trial, and it became this huge national, thing. It was like today, it would be the equivalent today if Court TV would be there covering 24 hours a day. CNN and Fox would have people arguing about it all the time. It became a big deal. In fact, so many reporters for newspapers all over the country showed up to cover this trial that they actually built an outdoor arena to have it in because they couldn't fit everybody into their little town courthouse. They built like a football stadium for the trial. And reporters came from everywhere. And the bad thing was the reporters wrote stories that were published in newspapers all over the country. They wrote stories talking about how stupid and ignorant the people of the South were. This represented a major blow to kind of the public relations of the South, because they looked like fools and idiots and peckerwoods to the rest of the country during this trial. The defense attorney, the guy that was brought in as a celebrity defense attorney, I'm sorry, not the prosecutor, celebrity prosecutor, the guy that the state of Tennessee brought in as a celebrity prosecutor to try to put Scopes in jail, put him in prison, was William Jennings Bryan. He had run for president a couple of times. He was a very fundamentalist Christian guy, and he served as the prosecutor. Whereas the defense attorney was Clarence Darrow, who represented the American Civil Liberties Union, a more liberal organization to defend Scopes. There is a movie about this trial called Inherit the Wind, where Spencer Tracy plays Clarence Darrow. I forget who plays Brian. Okay, so the trial goes on for weeks and weeks. They argue back and forth, with Darrow mostly arguing that the law itself is wrong. But Brian kept pointing out the law is not on trial. Mr. Scopes is on trial. So ultimately, of course, he's found guilty because everybody knew he had done it. They just wanted to make the trial about the law being right or wrong. And so ultimately, he's found guilty. But ultimately, Clarence Darrow painted the crime as so inconsequential that Scopes was fined $1. So Scopes paid his $1 and didn't go to prison. So it was a win for Brian, but it was really a win for progressivism and Darrow and the ACLU. But the real outcome of this trial was that the South looked stupid and backwards and ignorant. Prohibition. This was another lingering leftover from the progressive era. Remember, the progressives had been made up of different groups of people all working together. One of the groups in the progressive movement were the temperance movement. They hated alcohol. And so, as you know, the women's rights, the women's suffrage group, they got their way. Other groups got their way. Well, the temperance movement got their way. Prohibition goes into effect with the 18th Amendment in 1919, just ahead of the women's right to vote, which was 19. Now, prohibition itself didn't make it illegal to drink alcohol. What prohibition said was it is illegal to manufacture it, it is illegal to sell it, and it is illegal to transport it. So if you happen to have a storehouse, a closet full of liquor, you could drink it in your own home till the cows come home, until it ran out, and you were fine. Nobody was going to arrest you. But if you went out and manufactured some more in your still, you broke the law. If you put what you had in the closet and put it in your car and drove it down the street, you broke the law. And if you sold it to somebody, you broke the law. So drink what you got, because there's not going to be any more. If you made your own, you were called. Okay, well, if you sold it in a secret bar, that was called a speakeasy, because you go up to the door and you go knock, 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 or whatever, and they'd go, and the door would open, and it's and then the police would find out and they would raid it. Everybody go to jail. So the speakeasies were the secret bars where you went to drink. Bootleggers were transporting it illegally. So bootlegging resulted in these super fast, souped up cars that would go really fast. They would put a big engine in a little nondescript looking, blah looking car, and they could outrun the law. This would be like the Dukes of Hazzard later, right? And so once prohibition goes away, you have all these souped up cars that look like normal cars, but they're super fast. They needed something to do with them, so they invented NASCAR. Stock car racing literally comes from prohibition and from bootleggers racing their bootlegger cars. They didn't look like race cars like in Indianapolis or Formula One. They looked like a car that the police wouldn't chase. And then, of course, if you manufactured it in your backyard and you're still, you were a moonshiner. And they would get you not only for violating the Prohibition law, which was called the Volstead Act that enforced it, they would also get you for avoiding taxes, liquor taxes, because most states and federal government has liquor tax. And if you make your own liquor, you're probably not charging tax and reporting that tax to the government. The Untouchables were enforcing prohibition across the country, particularly in Chicago, famously, with Al Capone being the gangster that was really in the big time of liquor. And so there's the Kevin Costner movie with Sean Connery and all, but this is the actual Elliot Ness. They were called Untouchables because they were federal agents who went after Al Capone and others, because when the gangsters would pay you to look the other way, they'd say they touched you. They put the touch on you, and you are now working for them. So these guys considered themselves untouchable, meaning they would not. You couldn't bribe them to look the other way. They were straight. They were Eagle Scouts. You know what I mean? They were Boy Scouts. They were no bad about them. All good in terms of that. In 1933, in the depths of the Depression, we repealed the Prohibition law, the constitutional amendment, which means, by the way, it's still there. It's just that another amendment came along in 33 that said, never mind. So we have one constitutional amendment that says you can't drink and another one that says, yeah, you can, never mind. They're both on the books. So there's 27 constitutional amendments, but 2 of them cancel each other out. And by the way, this also led to things like the Indianapolis 500, which you see there. I don't really have time to talk about all that right now. Normally in class, I would expansively talk about how Carl Fisher created this event, and that's what it looks like today. Well, not today, obviously, but up until coronavirus. You also had the flappers in the Roaring Twenties, where women suddenly, modern young women suddenly rebelled against conventional standards. They went out and got jobs, which was unheard of. They had their own money for the first time. They weren't just, think about women up until this point. Women were an extension of their husband. When you were young, you were an extension of your father and your family. You were a daughter. And then the idea was once you were old enough, you should quickly marry someone and you will then become an extension of their husband. So women were never really themselves. They were either like a little girl under their father's control, or they were the wife under the husband's control. So think about, like, if you were a young woman who married Mr. John Smith, your name was Mrs. John Smith, basically. That's how they referred to you, Mrs. John Smith. Or they'd say Mr. and Mrs. John Smith. They wouldn't say Mr. John Smith and Mrs. Mary Jones Smith, or whatever. You just kind of became an invisible extension of your husband or your father. And so women began to rebel against that, had their own jobs and money. They got the short haircuts that were because the style was long, of course, the conservative period. And they wore the really short dresses. They went out dancing and all that. From 1910 through 1930, there was a large African-American migration from the South and North. This is how so many of my students, when I used to live in Alabama and Georgia, many of my African-American students would always mention they had cousins in Philadelphia or Detroit or Chicago or somewhere like that. I'm like, yes, because part of your family, 80 years ago moved to the North, and the other part stayed in the South. And so black families were divided between those that stayed in the South and those that moved to the big cities in the North. And what they did was they spread Southern and black culture to other parts of the country, which was an invaluable contribution in everything from food and cooking to music to fashion, right? One thing after another, African-American migration spread eventually the entire country, and we owe a tremendous debt to things like the blues and jazz, and eventually rock and roll comes out of that. Just to mention one out of many. One very important leader during that time, W.B. Du Bois. He wasn't French, so it wasn't Du Bois, it was Du Bois. He founded the NAACP in 1910, which was the largest minority advocacy organization. They would send lawyers to help African Americans who were being treated badly by the law, by the government. I have a blank page there. That's odd. After Coolidge finishes his second term, or 1.5, the country elects a third conservative Republican in a row. Now, interesting thing, this would be the last truly conservative Republican president until 1981. Conservatives become so discredited during the 30s that we don't elect another one. We either elect moderate Republicans or Democrats for the next 52 years or 48 years. I forget which. I'm not going to do the math right now. But Herbert Hoover, conservative Republican, he had been like the Secretary of Commerce. He's president for a while. And then on October 29, 1929, the stock market crashes. It's Black Tuesday. Fortunes are wiped out. Businessmen jumping out the windows of their office buildings rather than go home and tell their wife they're broke. Banks failed. And Hoover really doesn't do anything about it because he's a conservative and he believes that the federal, like Coolidge, believes the federal government shouldn't really get involved in these kind of things. This is private business, private matters that the government shouldn't be involved in. And there's the drop after Black Tuesday and poverty across the country. And so in 1932, Franklin Roosevelt, the governor of New York and the second cousin, I believe, of Teddy Roosevelt, who had been a Republican, remember, Franklin was a Democrat, and he proposed the New Deal. Now, remember, his second cousin, Teddy, had proposed the Square Deal. So he's trying to evoke memories of this very popular president who was his relative. Distant relative. It was two branches of the Roosevelt family. He's on the Hyde Park branch, not the Sagamore Hill branch. He wins the election in a landslide. There's Roosevelt in blue and the Republican in red. Tremendous landslide for the Roosevelt. All right, and that gets us through the 20s. Now, in our second part of the hour here, we will look at the 30s. And this is the last thing that will be on the midterm. Okay, so FDR and the New Deal. There he is. One thing about Roosevelt is, as you see there, he was in a wheelchair. He would walk, quote unquote, by having these incredibly heavy steel braces strapped to his legs to keep his legs straight. And then he would use his arms. He worked up his strength of his arms, kind of like on parallel bars, to walk by using his upper body to throw the weight of his legs forward. He would usually have somebody on either side of him to kind of support him, but he could walk somewhat using his upper body strength. What had happened was, when he was a grown person, he had been swimming off the coast of Maine, I believe, and he got a fever and went and lay down. And when he woke up that afternoon, he couldn't move his legs. And it never came back. And it was believed to be polio, but we don't know for sure. It was diagnosed at the time as polio. The New Deal was legislation he proposed to Congress that represented a dramatic expansion of the federal government. Remember, the federal government up to this point had been really small. The progressives had tried to make government bigger. But Roosevelt says we're really going to make government bigger because it's the only thing that can stand up to big business and protect consumers and protect the workers. This completed the abandonment of laissez-faire capitalism in the U.S. Now, what is laissez-faire capitalism? This is unregulated capitalism with no referee. Remember, I talked about this before. The capitalism we have today, more or less, has a referee of some kind or another, some kind of government agency or watchdog to make sure everybody's playing fair and can throw the flag and enforce it. You could send somebody off to prison for insider trading and stuff like that. But back then, we still had this laissez-faire capitalism, every man for himself. And so we abandon that, mercifully, and go the range of more regulated capitalism to look out for people. The speed and the number of reforms in the New Deal was very high. Roosevelt just started cranking stuff out. There were, in fact, 2 New Deals. The first New Deal included the FDIC, which just guaranteed that the federal government would pay you back if the money you put in a bank went away, right? In other words, if you went to the bank and gave them $100,000, and then the bank said, oh, we lost your $100,000, sorry, before you're just out of luck, the money's gone. After this, the federal government cuts you a check for $100,000, and that was the maximum. Today it's $250,000, but it used to be $100,000. What did this do? This is the federal government trying to restore people's confidence in banks. You have to have banks for an economy to work. You can't have business and investment and everything if you don't have banks. So we needed people to trust the banks, but they had lost confidence in the banks when the banks lost all their money with the crash, the Great Depression. So the first thing Roosevelt wanted to do was restore people's confidence in our institutions and in our banks. And so this says you don't have to trust the bank, because if the bank loses your money again, the government will pay you. Banks had to be solvent to open. Roosevelt closed down all the banks and said you have to have money or you can't be open. If you can't give people their money back when they come and make a withdrawal. He also put regulations on the stock exchange. And finally, give some subsidies to the farmers. The second New Deal, a couple of years later, was more radical and more for the workers, pro-labor, and in fact, some even said it was anti-business. Remember, even his cousin Teddy had said big business is here to stay. Big business is here to stay. Franklin's kind of like, anti-business. He created the National Labor Relations Act to define unfair. That means like if your boss can't mistreat you in terms of your pay and how you're hired and fired and how you're treated at work, the government would look out for that. The government also guaranteed the right to have unions. They created the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. A lot of people in the South still, believe it or not, didn't have electricity in the early 20th century, in the 1920s and 30s. The electricity just didn't go to the poor places in Appalachia and in the Tennessee River Valley. And so Roosevelt said, and plus the rivers would flood sometimes and be bad. So Roosevelt used the federal government to construct dams on the big rivers of the South to create electricity. So the dams also protected people from flooding and generated electricity. So suddenly the South had electricity. You go back and look at that map of his election, you say, how could the South, how could the West that's so conservative, how could they vote for the most liberal president we've ever had? Because he gave them electricity, he gave them telephones, he gave them protection in case the bank lost their money again. I mean, he was doing all this for poor people and low-income people, and they loved it. They also created the WPA, the Works Progress. There were so many people out of work that were unemployed. This is a federal organization, the largest employer in the U.S. during those years, that paid people to do jobs that needed doing but weren't getting done. So I have a graphic here of it gave jobs to people that were unemployed. I love that here you got a photographer taking a picture of an artist, drawing a picture of a man supervising guys building a median in a town. Everybody's got a job there. Here's some of the various things that the WPA did. Usually today where you'll see their plaque, what's left today is on like the little picnic areas in state parks, like where there'll be a roof and then poles holding it up. There'll be like a charcoal grill. A lot of those were built back in the 30s by the WPA. The Social Security Act of 35 created what we call Social Security, still around, of course, today. Gave you your Social Security number, but it gives you retirement insurance, insurance for when you're old, for when you lose your work. That's the unemployment check, and for the disabled, disability insurance. So Social Security continues to be a very popular program that older people will fight to the death to defend. Congress, the Supreme Court didn't like the New Deal at first. They thought it was too radical, too unconstitutional, and they started overturning the law. And so Roosevelt said, well, I'm just going to pack the court. This is true. There really is no law that says there have to be 9 members of the Supreme Court. Any president that wanted to roll the dice could nominate more members anytime they wanted to. It's just become a tradition that we keep it at 9. It hadn't always been 9. It was 6, 7, and 8 at different times in the past. But Roosevelt said, I'm going to add 6 more. We're going to go to 15. Let's see what happens then. And the American public, this cartoon kind of summarized it, even people that liked Roosevelt and voted for him said, well, that's a little bit much, right? You're adding 6 members to the Supreme Court. And so I have a couple of cartoons here of a cartoonist reaction to just packing the court with your own. I mean, let's just imagine if Donald Trump or Barack Obama had put 6 more members, like if Trump put 6 more Kavanaughs or Obama put 6 more Ruth Bader Ginsburgs on the court, right? The other side would lose their minds, and understandably. So people lost their minds at Roosevelt talking about doing this. Ultimately, do it, and enough people retired or changed their mind that the New Deal was able to happen. So they worked it out. So in 1936, he is overwhelmingly real. That's a huge re-election map right there. Still no Alaska and Hawaii, but he won everything else except Vermont and Maine. That is a blowout. And then in 1940, he wins an unprecedented 3rd term. That had never been done before. 3 terms for one president. And that was because, in our last little section here, he had spent 8 years as president, but as he's wrapping up his 2nd term, and you're thinking this is going to be it for him, that's when World War II starts brewing in Europe. And Roosevelt says, oh, well, I don't want to leave now because now we got this giant world war possibly coming up that we got to worry about. So in 1940, with the world at war, not America yet, but everybody else, Roosevelt runs for the 3rd term saying, I'm still needed. I'm going to deal with World War II, and he wins. So you had these militaristic, totalitarian dictatorship regimes in power in the early 30s. In Germany, of course, you had Adolf Hitler, you know him, and the Nazis. In Italy, you had Il Duce Benito Mussolini and the fascist party. They didn't play around. Hitler created his own name for the fascist party in Germany, but the Italians just called their party the fascist party. They're just like, nah, dude, it's a fascist party. We're not going to lie. And then in Japan, they didn't really have a name for it, but you had Emperor Hirohito and a very militaristic fascist government under him. Okay? So that's the 3 major Axis. They call them the Axis bad guys of World War II countries. And understand one thing, by the way, about this. In World War I, remember, that had been a clash of royal families. The emperor of this, the czar of that, the Kaiser of this, right? You know, the United States stayed out of that as long as it could because to us it looked like a bunch of royal families having a royal rumble, as the wrestlers say. But almost all of those royal families got overthrown by World War I. They set fire to their own house, and their own house burned down. So when in the 1920s and 30s, those royal families were replaced in many countries by political parties, by extreme political parties like the Nazis in Germany, like the communists in the Soviet Union, like the fascists in Italy, and so on. World War I was a royal family rumble. World War II will be our first real political ideology war. Left versus right, with the United States in the middle and trying to stay out of it again. Left with the Soviet Union and Stalin, right with Hitler and Mussolini and Hirohito. So by 1935, all 3 of those bad guys had expanded by military conquest. And meanwhile, in the United States, you had the America First movement, which wanted isolationism and neutrality. We look back now and realize that America First was really a kind of a pro-Nazi sympathizer movement. They went along with the Nazis. They looked the other way with the Nazis. They didn't want America involved, going against them. And, you know, you hear that term America First again today, and that's very deliberate. September of 1939, Nazi Germany invades Poland. This was the line Britain and France had drawn in the sand and said, look, Hitler, if you take one more step toward Poland, it's on. And they did. And so Britain and France declare war on Germany. They called this the phony war, though, because they never actually fought each other for like 6 months. They declared war against each other and didn't really do anything. They were all building up. All three of them were building up to prepare against each other. Meanwhile, this is where Roosevelt won his third term, and I thought these buttons were funny. They're anti-Roosevelt, anti-third term buttons. November of 40 is when he gets his third term, unprecedented. March of 41, the Lend-Lease program, which is really important, more important than people realize. People do, I think, remember when those that know anything about the Lend-Lease program know that it was America giving weapons and supplies to Britain, even as we called ourselves neutral. But Lend-Lease also included giving a whole lot of weapons and supplies to the Soviet Union, to the Russians, because they had been invaded by Germany at this point too. And we felt like if the Russians fall, then we're in deep trouble. The Nazis are going to rule Europe and Asia, and we're going to be over here on our continent isolated. So there's Lend-Lease, and I like how they're framing it. Uncle Sam is just accidentally dumping this stuff in the ocean, and it just drifts over to British ports. It also drifted all the way to the Soviet Union somehow. Wasn't that amazing? All right, and finally, our last thing for today, Japan was part of this, right? Japan was part of this axis. And Japan is a volcanic island. They don't have a lot of natural resources. If you think about the Eurasian landmass, you have the British Isles on one end, and they're basically like a piece of France broke off. So they've got coal and iron ore and steel and all that. Japan, though, is a product of the volcanic eruptions around the Pacific Rim. So it's like if you dig a hole in Japan, you hit lava, hardened lava. There's no natural resources. So Japan has to buy or borrow their resources from other countries. So Japan had been Japan had been buying scrap metal from the United States. And to build their war machine, they had our metal. But they'd sail ships over here, load up all the scrap metal we had, and take it back to Japan and melt it down and make their airplanes and aircraft carriers and tanks and battleships and guns. They also needed rubber for tires. They needed glass. They needed all kind of other parts to make modern military equipment. So the Japanese were looking at places like China and Australia and Malaysia and Indonesia to get the raw materials they needed to be a big empire, and they start invading these places, particularly coastal China and Korea, were treated terribly by the Japanese. And the United States said, hey, look, if you're going to keep being so mean to your neighbors, Japan, we are going to cut off your supply of scrap iron. Well, Japan knew that that would be critically dangerous to them because without American scrap iron, their war machine would choke to death. They also knew that only the United States had the potential to stop their expansion in the Pacific. What Japan wanted was to control the Pacific Ocean and push us all the way back to California, basically. And in order to do that, Japan needed to capture basically Hawaii. Japan, I don't think, ever really had any plans of invading California. And, you see all these alternate history things where Japan captures all the way to the Rocky Mountains or the Mississippi River or whatever. And no, I don't think that was ever their plan. They just wanted control of the Pacific Ocean. But they knew that in order to do that, they had to sweep the British Navy out of the Pacific, and they had to sweep the American Navy. They took the British Navy out pretty easily, even with Lend-Lease. The British were on the run. But the Japanese knew that what they really needed to do was defeat the United States before we ever could get a start at getting ready to fight them. Because the Japanese understood, here's Japan militarily at this point, and here's America militarily at this point. But how high could what's the potential? Japan's potential was to go like that. America's potential was to go like that, okay? So if you're going to fight America, you need to knock them out, sucker punch them now, and get the Americans down while they're not looking, and then you can dictate, we control the Pacific, America. You go back to California. So the idea of Pearl Harbor was hit the Americans fast and hard, and so hard that it just knocks them on the ground and they can't get back up to defend the Pacific. Okay, didn't mean they were going to be in Los Angeles the next day. It just meant that we wouldn't theoretically be in Tokyo the next day either. You know what I mean? So they wanted to control the Pacific, and so they slapped down our military base in Hawaii. As we were telling them to stop messing with China and Korea, we also froze their money in our banks, because every country in the world puts money in U.S. banks. It's secure and get good interest and all that. The Japanese diplomats were in Washington negotiating, and then on Friday and Saturday. And Saturday night, they all disappeared. They all went home, and nobody, well, what happened to the Japanese? Where'd they go? And then you wake up Sunday morning, and boom. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in infamy, said Franklin Roosevelt to Congress the next day, where, without warning, the Japanese sent 4 aircraft carriers to attack Hawaii, to attack the massive U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. We helped them out. We had our battleships lined up around Ford Island, what they call Battleship Row. So the Japanese could just go down and attack all the battleships at once, drop bombs and machine guns. Of course, most infamously, the Arizona was sunk with all aboard killed. Thousands were killed, several battleships. The Arizona is the one who had the memorial. And so the next day, after this shocking surprise attack, President Roosevelt goes to Congress and asks Congress to declare war on Japan. And Congress, with like a vote of, I don't know the exact number, but today it would be like 98-2. Congress declared war on Japan. Germany responded by declaring war on the United States in solidarity with their ally, Japan. We might not have ever attacked Germany if they left us alone, but when Germany declared war on us after Pearl Harbor, we declared war back on them. And Winston Churchill in Britain says, okay, now that America is at war with both, I need you, Franklin Roosevelt, to concentrate on Germany first. And that's what we did. We put most of our efforts in the first couple of years of the war into fighting Germany. And then by 1945, we were really hammering away at Japan and closing in on, when we dropped the atomic bomb. So we will look at the course of World War II next week and beyond. We'll look at World War II and beyond next week. That'll be for the third test, so don't worry about that right now. But by the way, this was the last time that the United States officially declared war on anybody. The last time the United States officially declared war on anybody was when we declared war on Japan, Germany, and Italy, December the 8th, 1941. And every war we fought since then has been without a declaration of war. It's been something else. I don't know what you want to call it, a police action, a military engagement, whatever. We haven't declared war on anybody since 41. Okay, so that's where the second test ends. It begins with, we talk about the progressive movement and all that. It's the last 5 sections. So yeah. So that one will go up a week from today. And in the meantime, I guess did we decide? Well, anyway, you already know. We've already talked about it. So, all right, I'm going to get on out of here. If you have any questions about anything, like I said, I'll be here this afternoon responding to your emails and working on setting this exam up for next week. So let me know if you have any questions about anything. If you need to talk to me privately, don't forget your paper coming up. Otherwise, I'll get on out of here and go grab something else to drink real quick before my 11 o'clock class. Woo! See you guys later. Have a good week.